Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're diving into a remarkably powerful story that honestly completely redefines how we look at data, science, and the environment. You know, we so often think of environmental science as this purely technical field, right? We picture charts, graphs, sterile laboratories. But the source material we're looking at today paints a wildly different picture. It actually takes us back to a very specific moment in 2003. The author describes taking a trip to visit a community living right next door to an industrial facility in the Calabarzon region. Now, this wasn't just some standard field trip. For the author, it ended up being the catalyst for a profoundly deep shift in perspective.
What I saw there changed everything. I mean, wow, that is the inciting incident of our story today. So the author explains that they'd been invited by a colleague to conduct what seemed like a completely routine environmental assessment of the area around this facility. Just a standard, everyday job. But this one singular visit ended up completely shifting their worldview. It's a pretty bold statement for sure, that a single site visit could literally change everything. But as we move through this, you'll see exactly how and why that shift happened.
Section 1. Expectation versus reality. Okay, let's dive into this. When the scientists arrived at the site, they were in full-on analytical mode, armed with a checklist of expected indicators. They were looking for air quality data. They were ready to take water quality samples. They were scanning for soil contamination markers. And honestly, this is exactly what you're trained to do in these assessments. You look for the scientific measurements. You look for numbers to crunch and put on a page. You fully expect to observe the environment through the safe, sterile lens of pure data. But here is where the story sharply pivots. What I found instead were people. Think about that for a second. The scientists didn't just find abstract numbers. They found a living, breathing community. This wasn't just a collection of data points waiting to be logged into some spreadsheet. It was a neighborhood. It was families. It was real human beings whose daily lives were intimately tangled up with the exact environmental conditions the scientist was there to measure.
Section 2. Behind every data point.
First, the scientist met a grandmother. She explained that she had not eaten fish from the local river in 3 whole years. And it wasn't because she just decided to change her diet. It was because the fish had simply disappeared. I want you to really feel the weight of that. A river that had probably sustained her community for generations was now entirely depleted of life. It's the absolute heartbreaking reality of a dead river, but told not through some complex biodiversity metric. It's told through a grandmother's empty plate.
Then there was a father. He brought his children over and actually showed the scientist the skin rashes covering his kids' bodies. And he asked, quietly, if these rashes were caused by the water. There is just this quiet, crushing desperation in that question. This father is relying on this water source to survive, seeing the physical harm it might be causing his own kids, and feeling completely uncertain and vulnerable. It instantly transforms a standard water quality sample into a matter of child safety.
And finally, there was a conversation with the local leadership. A barangay captain who had spent 5 years trying to get someone, literally anyone, to pay attention. He had filed 17 separate complaints with the Department of Environment and Natural Resources. That's half a decade of effort, half a decade of going through the proper channels, begging for some kind of systemic intervention to protect his community.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is the staggering, devastating bureaucratic apathy attached to this number. 17 complaints. And in return, they received exactly 17 form letter responses. No action, no relief whatsoever. Just 17 standardized hollow replies stretched out over 5 years. It perfectly captures the frustrating, systematic failure experienced by the people living in the shadow of this facility.
Because of this continuous, crushing failure, the community had adapted in the most tragic way possible. The author notes that they had essentially learned to live with the pollution the way a person learns to live with chronic pain. And to be clear, it wasn't because the pollution was acceptable to them. It was because they had absolutely zero power to stop it. When your government just sends you form letters and your river literally dies, you're forced into this state of powerless endurance.
Section 3. Science and Responsibility.
So the scientists went home that night and they couldn't sleep. It wasn't because of the measurements they'd taken all day. It was because of the undeniable human suffering they had witnessed. They had spent years studying environmental science. I mean, as an expert in the chemistry of industrial pollutants, the biology of ecosystem degradation, and the physics of air dispersion modeling, they had all the deep, complex technical knowledge in the world. But lying awake that night, they realized there was a massive gap between knowing the science and understanding the reality. And this brilliantly illustrates that exact gap. It maps those sterile scientific terms directly back to the vulnerable human beings they actually represent. Wastewater discharge isn't just some parameter on a clipboard. It's a family drinking from a river. Air quality isn't just a measurement.
It's a living, breathing child inhaling that exact air. The data points aren't just numbers. They are people.
Which brings us to this incredibly beautiful, redefined definition of the field. The author realized that night that sustainability is absolutely not an abstract technical discipline. It is a profoundly human one. Every single environmental metric we track has a direct, undeniable tie to human health, to human dignity, and frankly, to human survival.
Because of this epiphany, everything changed. From that day forward, the author stopped teaching sustainability merely as a science and started teaching it as a profound responsibility. The whole framework shifted. Step 1, the science is simply the tool. It's the how. But step 2, the responsibility? That is the reason. It's the why. We don't measure pollution just to log it in a textbook somewhere. We measure it to protect the grandmother, the father, and the children we talked about earlier.
Which leaves us with the abrupt, really thought-provoking cliffhanger that the source material ends on. The science is the tool, the responsibility is the reason, and the reason is always well, how do you fill in that blank? When you look at the data in your own life, your own work, or your own community, what is the human element hiding behind it? Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. Definitely keep that question in mind the next time you see a number on a page,